For 3,000 years, the greatest river in the world kept its secret. The ancient Egyptians built their entire civilization on the Nile, grew their grain in its floodplain, drank its water, buried their pharaohs in monuments aligned to its stars, worshipped the god of its annual inundation as one of the supreme divine forces in the universe. They depended on the Nile more completely than any people has ever depended on any river. And they had absolutely no idea where it came from. The Greeks knew about the mystery. Herodotus, the father of history, traveling through Egypt in the 5th century BCE, asked every Egyptian priest and official he could find about the source of the Nile and received answers that combined genuine geographical ignorance with the specific creative confidence of people who did not want to admit they did not know. The river came from bottomless fountains in the desert, some said. It came from the ocean that encircled the world. It came from the melting snows of mountains so high that no human being had ever seen them, this last being actually closest to the truth, though it was stated without any evidence and was immediately dismissed by Herodotus as unlikely. Alexander the Great wanted to find the source of the Nile. Julius Caesar, during his time in Alexandria with Cleopatra, reportedly expressed the wish that finding the Nile's source would be worth more to him than any military conquest. The Roman Emperor Nero sent 2 centurions specifically tasked with following the river to its origin. They got as far as the Sud, the enormous swamp in what is now South Sudan, where the papyrus and the water hyacinth and the floating vegetation islands created a waterway so labyrinthine and so impenetrable that their boats could go no further. They turned back. The secret held. The medieval Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi placed the source of the Nile in a range of mountains in Central Africa that he called the Mountains of the Moon, a name that had appeared in the geographical tradition since the 2nd century CE, when the Greek geographer Ptolemy had mentioned mountains of that name as the likely origin of the great river. Al-Idrisi's map showed the Nile rising from lakes fed by the Mountains of the Moon and flowing north across the continent to Egypt. A description that was, in its broad outline, substantially correct, though the details were largely imagined. The Mountains of the Moon. The source of the Nile. For 3,000 years these phrases had the specific quality of things that were believed to exist but had never been verified, the geographical equivalent of the philosopher's stone, the end of the rainbow, the thing that you knew was real but could not quite reach. The Victorian era brought the obsession to its peak. The expansion of European geographical knowledge in the 19th century, driven by the same commercial and imperial forces that were reshaping the world's political map, expressed through the Royal Geographical Society in London and its network of explorers, supported by the specific Victorian conviction that the unknown parts of the world were problems to be solved rather than mysteries to be respected, focused on Africa with an intensity that produced some of the most extraordinary and most morally complicated exploration in the history of human geography. Africa in the mid-19th century was, from the European perspective, the continent most resistant to geographical knowledge. The coasts were well mapped, the slave trade and the legitimate commerce that succeeded it had given European navigators excellent knowledge of the African coastline. But the interior, the enormous heart of the continent, the rainforests and the savannas and the Great Lakes and the river systems that drained the continent's interior, was still, from the European perspective, a vast blank on the map, populated by peoples and kingdoms and ecological systems of extraordinary complexity and richness that the European geographical tradition had simply not penetrated. Into this world came the most remarkable group of obsessives that the Victorian era produced, the African explorers, the men who spent years and decades pushing into the interior of a continent that was simultaneously beautiful, hostile, disease-ridden, and politically complex in ways that their European assumptions left them systematically unprepared to understand. David Livingstone, Richard Burton, John Hanning Speke, Samuel Baker, James Grant, Henry Morton Stanley. These were the names that the Victorian public followed with the specific breathless attention that a later age would give to astronauts, men pushing into the unknown, risking everything, and sending back dispatches from the edge of the known world that filled the newspapers and the lecture halls of Britain with the particular excitement of the frontier. And the greatest prize, the geographical holy grail of the Victorian era, was the source of the Nile. The man whose name history has most firmly attached to the answer, though the attachment is contested, has always been contested, and involves one of the most acrimonious personal disputes in the entire history of geographical exploration, is John Hanning Speke. And his story, of obsession and illness and courage and almost certainly correct geographical instinct and a personal tragedy so dramatic that it has never been fully explained, is one of the most extraordinary in the entire literature of exploration. John Hanning Speke was born on May 4, 1827, in Bideford, Devon. The son of a Somerset landowner, educated at the specific combination of country house and public school that produced the officer class of the Victorian British Empire, commissioned into the Bengal Infantry of the East India Company at the age of 17. He was a soldier first and an explorer by passion, the specific passion of someone who found in the physical challenge and the geographical novelty of unexplored territory a satisfaction that the routine of military life could never provide. His Indian military service gave him the foundation of the physical toughness and the practical bushcraft that African exploration would demand. He spent years on hunting expeditions in the Himalayas and in Tibet, developing the specific combination of marksmanship and endurance and the ability to live in extreme conditions that his African expeditions would require. He was a serious naturalist, collecting specimens, observing animal behavior, keeping records, in the specific Victorian tradition that combined scientific observation with the sporting pleasure of the hunt in a way that seems contradictory to modern sensibilities, but that was entirely natural to the educated Victorian gentleman explorer. The African adventure began in 1854, with Richard Francis Burton, the most flamboyant and the most intellectually brilliant of the Victorian explorers, a man who spoke 29 languages, had made the pilgrimage to Mecca disguised as an Arab, and whose combination of genuine scholarly genius and specific personal instability made him one of the most remarkable and most difficult human beings of his age. Burton was the expedition leader. Speke was a junior member. They were sailing for the East African coast and the possibility of penetrating the African interior from the Somali ports, a route that no European had yet attempted. The first expedition ended in disaster. At Berbera, the Somali port that was the base for their inland attempt, the camp was attacked at night by Somali warriors. One member of the party was killed. Burton was severely wounded, a spear through both cheeks that left permanent scars. Speke was captured, stabbed multiple times while escaping, and managed to survive through the specific combination of physical toughness and good fortune that African exploration seemed to demand as a baseline entry requirement. He returned to Britain, recovered, and went back for more. The second expedition, 1856 to 1859, the expedition that changed everything, took Burton and Speke south from the East African coast at Zanzibar, following the Arab trade routes into the interior of what is now Tanzania, in search of the Great Lakes that Arab merchants had been describing for years as the source of the Nile. The Arab traders who controlled the caravan routes of East Africa had better geographical knowledge of the interior than any European, and the lakes they described, vast inland seas, so large that the Arab traders who had seen them struggled to convey their scale to people who had never encountered anything like them, were clearly the most significant geographical feature of the interior. The march from the coast to the interior was one of the most physically brutal in the literature of African exploration. The caravan, Burton and Speke, approximately 130 porters and soldiers, Arab merchants joining and leaving along the route, traveled through environments of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary hostility. The coastal strip gave way to the Nyika, the thornbush wilderness that extended for hundreds of kilometers inland, and the Nyika gave way to the highland plateau of central Tanzania with its combination of open grassland and dense forest and the specific disease environment that made East African exploration such a biological lottery. Both men were sick for most of the journey. The specific combination of malaria, dysentery, and the unidentified fevers that African exploration reliably produced reduced both of them to conditions of genuine physical debility for extended periods of the march. Burton suffered from a partial paralysis that affected his legs and his voice at various points. Speke suffered from an eye infection, contracted when a beetle entered his ear canal and he attempted to remove it with a knife, causing damage that left him partially deaf and suffering from recurring eye problems that at its worst left him nearly blind. They continued. Because stopping was not an option, and because the thing they were looking for was somewhere ahead of them, and because the specific quality that Victorian exploration demanded above everything else was the refusal to turn back. They reached Lake Tanganyika, the second largest freshwater lake in the world, the longest lake in the world. Its waters colored the specific deep blue that large, very deep lakes produce, extending to a horizon that genuinely looked like a sea, in February 1858. Burton was certain that this was the source of the Nile. The lake was vast. It lay in the interior of Africa at approximately the right latitude. It seemed to him, with the geographical logic of someone who had been thinking about this problem for years, to be the obvious answer. Speke was not convinced. And when Burton's illness prevented him from accompanying a scouting expedition north, while Burton remained at the Arab trading post of Karzeh recovering, Speke pushed north with a smaller party and found something that Burton had not anticipated. Lake Victoria. On July 30, 1858, John Hanning Speke became the first European to see the lake that he immediately recognized as the most significant body of water in sub-Saharan Africa. A vast, shallow, island-studded freshwater sea so enormous that standing on its shore gave no sense of the far bank. He estimated it correctly as much larger than Lake Tanganyika. He named it Lake Victoria, after the British Queen. And he concluded, immediately, from a combination of its size, its position, and the geographical logic of the river systems he had been studying, that this was the source of the Nile. He had spent only 3 days at the lake. He had not circumnavigated it. He had not found the point where the Nile flows out of it. He had not followed the outflow north to confirm that it connected to the river that eventually reached Egypt. He had, in effect, made an enormous intuitive leap based on limited observation, and the leap was almost certainly correct, which made it no less enormous and no less vulnerable to challenge. He returned to Karzeh. He told Burton what he had found and what he believed. Burton was skeptical. The evidence was insufficient, the logic was intuitive rather than demonstrated, and the specific competitive dynamic of two men who had spent 2 years being ill together in the African interior while competing for the same geographical prize was not a dynamic that encouraged either of them toward charitable interpretations of the other's conclusions. The disagreement that began at Karzeh on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1858 became one of the most famous controversies in Victorian science, lasting years, played out in the lecture halls and the journals and the newspapers of Britain, generating a level of public interest and personal rancor that would eventually end in tragedy. They returned to the coast together. They returned to Britain together. And then Speke, in an act that Burton considered a betrayal of the partnership that had endured 2 years of shared suffering in the African interior, announced his conclusions to the Royal Geographical Society without Burton, claimed the priority of his Lake Victoria discovery, and accepted the commission for a second expedition to prove what the first had only asserted. The second Speke expedition, 1860 to 1863, conducted with a companion named James Augustus Grant, was the expedition that produced the proof. Or the evidence that Speke, at least, considered proof. With Grant, a Scottish Army officer of reliable courage and reliable willingness to play second fiddle to Speke's geographical ambitions, Speke marched north from the coast to Lake Victoria, circumnavigated significant portions of the lake, was received at the court of the Kabaka of Buganda, the powerful kingdom on the northern shore of the lake, whose ruler Mutesa I was one of the most sophisticated political figures in East Africa and who received the British explorers with the specific combination of genuine curiosity and political calculation of a king assessing what these strangers represented, and eventually found the point on the northern shore of Lake Victoria where the Nile flows out. He called it Ripon Falls, after the president of the Royal Geographical Society, on July 28, 1862. He stood on the bank and watched the river flowing north out of the lake and wrote, in the journal that would eventually be published as Journal of the Discovery of the Source of the Nile, the words that he believed settled the question forever. The Nile is settled. It was not settled. The geographical debate continued, Burton and his supporters arguing that Speke had not followed the river continuously from the lake to Egypt, that there might be other sources to the west, that the outflow he had found might not be the primary inflow of the Nile system but merely one contributor among several. Speke had indeed not followed the river continuously, he had traced sections of it and been forced away from the bank by terrain and by the political geography of the kingdoms through which it passed, rejoining it periodically rather than following it bank by bank from the lake to Khartoum. The specific accusation, that his evidence, while suggestive, was not conclusive, had a technical validity that the completeness of his geographical intuition could not entirely overcome. A great debate was organized for September 16, 1864, in Bath, Speke and Burton to confront each other publicly before the British Association for the Advancement of Science, before the largest and most scientifically sophisticated audience that Victorian public life could provide, with the question of the Nile's source to be argued and assessed and, the optimists hoped, resolved. On the afternoon of September 15, 1864, the day before the debate, Speke went shooting at a relative's estate near Bath. He died of a gunshot wound at approximately 4 in the afternoon. He was 37 years old. The shot came from his own gun. Whether it was an accident, Speke was climbing a stone wall with his loaded gun and may have caught the trigger, or whether it was a deliberate act, the specific response of a man who could not face the public confrontation with Burton the following morning has never been determined. The coroner returned a verdict of accidental death. Burton, who was told of the death at the debate venue, reportedly said nothing for a moment, then said, "By God, he's killed himself." He did not elaborate on what he meant by the statement. He never elaborated publicly. The mystery has remained open for 160 years. The geographical question that Speke died without publicly defending was eventually resolved in his favor, substantially, though not completely. Samuel Baker, pushing north from the opposite direction, found Lake Albert, another large lake that also feeds the Nile system, in 1864, adding a complexity to the picture that Speke's Lake Victoria discovery had not anticipated. Henry Morton Stanley, who found Livingstone in 1871 with the famous greeting "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," one of the most famous sentences in the history of exploration, circumnavigated Lake Victoria completely in 1875 and confirmed that it had only one major outlet, the Victoria Nile that Speke had identified at Ripon Falls. Livingstone himself, whose expeditions in southern and central Africa were the most extensive and the most influential of the Victorian era, who spent 30 years in Africa and whose death in 1873, kneeling in prayer in a hut in what is now Zambia, produced one of the most famous scenes of the Victorian age, died still searching for the Nile's source, convinced to the end that it lay further south and further west than Speke had found, in the watershed of the Congo and Zambezi rivers. He was wrong. The loyalty of his African companions, who carried his body over 1,000 miles to the coast over 9 months so that it could be returned to Britain, was the most genuine tribute his life received. The modern understanding of the Nile's source is more complex than anything Victorian geography could have resolved with the tools available to it. The Nile has 2 main tributaries, the White Nile, which flows from Lake Victoria through Uganda and Sudan, and the Blue Nile, which flows from Lake Tana in the Ethiopian highlands. The 2 rivers meet at Khartoum in Sudan and flow north together as the single river that reaches Egypt. The Blue Nile contributes approximately 85% of the Nile's water and virtually all of its sediment, the specific silt that made the Egyptian floodplain the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world. The White Nile, Speke's Nile, flowing from Lake Victoria, contributes approximately 15% of the water but provides the consistent base flow that keeps the river running through the dry season when the Blue Nile's contribution is reduced. But if the question is which is the most remote source, the single point on the Earth's surface furthest from the Nile's mouth, the origin of the water that has traveled the greatest distance to reach Egypt, the answer, established by modern geographical research, points not to Lake Victoria itself but to the headwaters of the Kagera River, which flows into Lake Victoria from the west and whose most remote source has been traced to a spring in Nyung Forest in Rwanda. The water from that spring travels approximately 6,700 kilometers to reach the Mediterranean, the longest river journey on Earth. Speke identified Lake Victoria. He was right about its fundamental importance. He died before he could fully prove it. The 3,000-year-old secret was answered, partially, provisionally, with the specific incompleteness that geographical truth always has at the moment of its first assertion, by a British soldier from Devon who had a beetle in his ear and survived being stabbed 11 times by Somali warriors and spent 3 years being sick in the African interior and stood on the bank of a river flowing out of the largest tropical lake on Earth and wrote 4 words that he believed settled everything. The Nile is settled. It was. Almost. Eventually. And the price of the answer was extraordinary, in years and in suffering and in the specific human cost of the Victorian conviction that the blank spaces on the map were problems that British determination could solve, regardless of what that determination cost the people who were already living in those spaces. The river still flows. North. as it always has. From the mountains and the lakes at the heart of Africa, through the Sud and the cataracts and the desert, to the Mediterranean and the memory of the civilization that built itself in its floodplain and never knew where it came from. Now we know. Speke knew first. And knowing cost him everything.